Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another book review. So, I usually don't review books like this. Usually, I'm reviewing Korean literature that's been translated into English. But several years ago, I worked for a Korean radio show and I did a book segment, and they would ask me to review English books that were popular in Korea at the time. This was over a decade ago that I started doing this. So I've been dusting off some of those old reviews to record them for the channel, and it was actually quite revisiting this particular book. So Veronica Roth's Divergent is that. Sorry, I was just gulping some tea before I turned the thing on. Um, Veronica Roth's Divergent is a young adult dystopian novel that rode the early 2010s wave of post-apocalyptic teen fiction. So I originally reviewed this back in 2014 for a radio show called EBS FM Morning Special. And this novel at the time, I can remember it, it arrived with considerable hype. And it was a bestseller that spawned a big budget film. But I think in hindsight, it emerges as a largely formulaic and rather uninspired entry into its genre. So I'm going to try and take a critical look at Divergence, the premise, the themes, and its legacy over the past decade plus now. I think basically what I'm going to say is that despite this initial popularity, the novel failed to distinguish itself in this very crowded field of YA dystopias. And it doesn't compare favorably to like the Hunger Games, and maybe even something like the Maze Runner, which was another sort of series that was out at the same time. And I think ultimately, Divergent serves as a case study in why some of these, YA phenomena fade quickly, and only a couple of them really endure. So, what is the premise? What's the setting for this particular YA dystopian novel? So, set in a post-apocalyptic Chicago of the future, Divergent presents a society that's rigidly divided into 5 factions, each dedicated to a particular virtue. So the factions are abnegation, which is selflessness, amity, which is peace, candor, which is honesty, dauntless, which is bravery, and erudite, which is intellect. And these 5 factions were created with the intent of making or maintaining social order by segregating people based on dominant personality traits. And at the age of 16, every citizen must take an aptitude test and then choose one of these factions as their permanent group in a public choosing ceremony. And those who fail the initiation of their chosen faction become factionless outcasts who are relegated to menial lives on the margins of society. So within this setting, we meet Beatrice Pryor, or just Triss, as she is referred to by most people in the story. Triss is a girl born into the humble abnegation faction. And Divergent follows Triss as she makes the fateful decision to leave her family and join the bold, dauntless faction. She's sort of seeking bravery and freedom over self denial. And Triss's test results at the choosing ceremony are inconclusive, marking her as a rare divergent who doesn't fit neatly into any one of the virtues. And this is a dangerous secret that she must guard in a society that prizes conformity. The novel's first 2 sections, the first 2 acts, essentially chronicle Triss's grueling initiation trials in the Dauntless faction. So this is like jumping onto moving trains and leaping off buildings and zip lining and learning hand-to-hand combat and sort of facing these sort of fear simulators, fear landscape, sort of virtual kind of fear experiences that force the dauntless initiates to confront their worst nightmares. And these sequences are kind of quite good fun, I guess. They deliver, no shortage of action, And they're sort of the core spectacle, if you like, of the this first Divergent book. And so Triss, she sort of fights to prove herself among the Dauntless, where she's sort of not welcome because she's from this other sort of group, and she develops this sort of slow burning romance with her mysterious instructor Tobias. But looming in the background is political unrest. The erudite faction's leader, Janine, plots to overthrow the governing abnegation leadership. And this eventually throws Triss into the middle of a kind of a civil war, into this sort of deadly power struggle between the factions. And in the final act, Divergent shifts from this sort of initiation story to a full-blown conflict, as Triss discovers a conspiracy to use mind control serum on dauntless soldiers to massacre abnegation. And so this forces her to sort of fight against the corrupt authorities of her world. And by the end, Triss and her group of allies that she's sort of put together or gathered to her, they must fight their own people to expose the truth. And this transforms the novel from a sort of coming of age tale into more of an outright rebellion storyline. So the concept is undeniably high concept and, initially intriguing. The idea of teenagers choosing their identity and faction at 16, essentially picking their life path, provides a dramatic backdrop that I think mirrors familiar adolescent anxieties. The setting of faction Chicago offers some quite evocative imagery from the humble, gray kind of neighborhoods of abnegation to the train jumping daredevilry of the Dauntless crew. And there's some clear stakes here for Triss. However, it must be noted that the Veronica Roth's world building is probably serviceable at best. It operates in very broad strokes. This sort of faction system is explained in fairly expository terms, and this logic of an entire society rigidly defined by 5 personality types is just often very simplistic and underexamined. You're asked to not ask many questions about how this society has functioned at all for it to, maintain any coherent sense. And there was, one I was, sort of looking through some reviews on Goodreads and on various other places when I was sort of, putting this script back together from over 10 years ago. And one of the reviewers called it an empty caricature of human traits, which is a little harsh, but maybe a little accurate. So the dauntless people, they're all sort of adrenaline junkies. The honest ones just kind of blurt out tactless truths. There's not much nuance or depth behind this sort of faction concept. At least I didn't think there was. And it's a very straightforward approach, so it makes it easy to follow, but it robs it of any complexity. And it really just feels like a kind of schematic dystopian kind of playground than any sort of fully realized culture, right? Maybe like a nice idea or the germ of a nice idea, but it doesn't really work. But anyway, we have this premise, and it does a decent job in setting the stage for Triss's personal journey and then the action that will follow it. So really, what I think Roth wants to do in this book is it's about identity, choice, and loyalty, right? And so the central conflict for Triss is an internal one that's familiar to many adolescents and many adolescent fiction. This tension between adhering to one's family or community expectations or forging an independent identity. And Triss's decision to leave abnegation and her parents in order to follow her own nature is this is just a familiar adolescent anxiety, right? This very difficult realization that coming into your own often means leaving family behind, maybe ideologically or even just in reality. And this, perhaps the richest thematic thread, examines that cost of growing up. So Triss has to redefine herself outside of the comfort of her upbringing, and in doing so, she experiences guilt and loneliness, but also liberation, and she experiences these things at the same time. And so this story very much just literalizes this coming of age theme through this kind of faction system, right? It's a structure that forces 16-year-olds to choose who they will be in public in front of the entire community, whilst they're obviously still quite young. And it's an exaggerated, heightened scenario that sort of exaggerates the real feelings that teens have about finding where they belong. And, it's really about, do you follow in your parents' footsteps, or do you kind of reject that and do your own thing? And Triss's journey from self doubt to confidence, she sort of excels in these dauntless trials, is kind of intended to show a teenager sort of coming into their own strength and identity. And so this theme does resonate strongly, I think, with the book's intended audience, or it did at the time. And it's probably the element that Divergent handles the most sincerely. And this concept of being divergent itself is just a very an obvious metaphor for individuality and resisting labels. And Triss is told that her ability to think independently makes her a threat to the system. And the novel clearly champions the importance of free will and having a multifaceted identity in a society that wants to reduce people to categories. So, good themes to sort of play around with, but unfortunately, while these themes are present, Divergent often examines them at a surface level, right? So the treatment of the subject here is very heavy handed. The characters just explicitly discuss the value of choice and bravery and selflessness. All of the messages are spelled out. And the book and Rolf just state ideas rather than interrogate them or kind of do anything terribly interesting with them. So for example, this key notion that no person can be defined by a single trait, hence the tragedy of this awful faction system, is an interesting critique of strict social categorization. But Divergent doesn't look into it beyond that one simple critique. This is bad. It doesn't explore it in any interesting ways, I thought. The lesson that's learned is just that rigid control is bad. Being yourself is good. But that doesn't really explore in any more depth than how I've just summarized it there. When it comes to character development, you do have this, a fun cast, but again, kind of a shallow, simplistic, obvious character. So Triss is very much just a classic, maybe cliched YA protagonist. She's just another chosen one. She is brave and determined and compassionate. She's a girl who starts small and uncertain, but grows into this formidable, sort of kick-ass kind of heroine through just grit and determination. And so you do have this arc of gaining confidence and learning to trust yourself. And this is quite engaging, if maybe a little overly familiar. She's resourceful. She's willing to stand up for other people. She has moments of vulnerability. These sort of first friendships and romances away from her family. So she is quite relatable. And she's not, she's not exceptionally gifted from the start. This is kind of gratifying. These days, you'll find people that are just wonderful straight off the bat. But Triss isn't, right? Triss has to go through a lot of struggle, right? Being divergent isn't a kind of superpower. She sort of genuinely struggles physically during training. I'm not sure if they would do it like that anymore. But she has this underdog quality, and that sort of invites, I think, sympathy and investment. And she's sort of an intentional every girl. Aside from this sort of divergent quality in her courage, she's really just an ordinary teenager. She doesn't have extreme talents. And so I think it can make it easy for the reader to sort of project yourself onto this rather blank character, maybe. Anyway, so it's because she's average, she can be a proxy for for the audience, right? They're while she's learning to shoot a gun and beat people up, you're learning to do that at the same time. But anyway, so this certainly seemed to help the book resonate with millions of teen readers at the time, and maybe not some not teen readers, who maybe see her as just a sort of a straightforward wish fulfillment heroine. But on the flip side of this sort of straightforward characterization is that she lacks complexity. Unlike, say, Katniss from the Hunger Games, who some people might argue isn't that well developed either, but Katniss is sort of torn more by moral conflicts and trauma, and her motivation is a little bit more nuanced, I think. Triss remains kind of one note. At least in this first book, I didn't go on and read the sequels, but in this first book, she's kind of a one note character. She's brave and she's kind. She's admirable, not particularly deep, right? And the story doesn't go out of its way to challenge her kind of fundamental qualities. She's almost always clearly in the right, and her main kind of struggle, apart from sort of physical danger, is just the usual kind of self-doubt or jealousy, and these things are mostly resolved without any kind of significant impact. And then Triss's love interest, Tobias, he's also just kind of the YA romantic hero template. He's tall and brooding and mysteriously aloof, but he has a good heart underneath. And not much more personality beyond that. He's brave and protective. That's about it. The romance follows a pretty standard trajectory. Can be a little sweet at times, I guess, but doesn't really add much depth to the story, other than giving Triss someone to sort of swoon over, and occasionally maybe just love, just have a crush on, right? The villains, the bad guys, the rivals are kind of also one-dimensional. The main antagonist, this Janine, is just a cold, intellectual schemer type who just wants power for vague reasons. She's just sinister, she just wants power. And she just sort of embodies tyranny, just some kind of tyranny for Triss to fight against. Again, no real nuance or certainly no sympathetic motive. The other people in her group are all kind of pretty predictable. You've got a sadistic bully, supportive friend, the cowardly person, and they're really, it's just the character's personality. You have one trait, and that's what they are. And so these people are, there's no surprises in any of this stuff, right? They're just sort of there to sort of keep the plot ticking over, give Triss some challenges or some allies, but there's no psychologically rich characters or character development or moral ambiguity, and it's all pretty flat, I have to say. And it's really more just about kind of jump. There's more action than introspection here. It's jumping off trains and zip lining from off buildings and things. And so it does introduce this idea that personal virtues can become vices, right? Like if you're too brave, it just becomes sort of reckless. But it doesn't really do much with that either. All of the I think basically all the characters, you basically stay good or bad. And the sort of the interrelationship or interpersonal drama is pretty straightforward. You know what's going to happen in most interactions. So I guess maybe the thing that we can praise it for is the sort of pacing and the action, right? So it's sort of written in this kind of punchy first-person style, so it keeps the scenes moving quickly. And Roth does a good job at building tension during these sort of initiation trials. Like the jumping onto trains and doing the hand-to-hand fighting. These sort of kind of fear simulations are kind of quite vivid and visceral and detailed. And she's trying to pull readers into each of these challenges, and the book doesn't really linger too long before the next sort of event arrives. And so that fast-paced narrative creates a thrilling reading experience for these type of things. As there was it's pretty brisk, right? It just kind of rushes you from one sort of set piece to another. And so that is good. That is good, but that relentless action and this linear kind of plot leave there's no room for nuanced world building or any exploration of the story's concepts. And most of the novel, like the middle section, is really just this kind of training montage of these kids, going through these sort of training extra like fist fighting and throwing knives or whatever. And it's really just there to just for Triss to overcome her fear and to sort out the kind of ranking and the initiatives or something. And so I guess they're kind of exciting, but they're kind of repetitive too. And the payoff is basically very limited, because in the final section, the story veers into a completely different storyline. You have this big sort of coup and then the faction war. And so it's really all of a lot of the stuff that came before is just kind of irrelevant. And so like there's a lot of the time she's worrying about is Triss going to sort of place high enough to avoid being kicked out of the Dauntless faction. But by the end, it just doesn't matter at all, because there's this sort of mass violence, civil war kind of happens, so that this whole thing is that if she's going to be high up or high enough up to stay in that group is completely irrelevant, just doesn't matter. And so you get these training scenes which then just kind of don't mean anything when you get to the sort of all this big stuff that happens in the conclusion. And the transition between these things is kind of jarring, actually. It doesn't really work, right? It's like these training scenes are the kind of thing you have to have in a young adult book. And then in the dystopian fiction, you have to have some kind of, some sort of civil war or some group oppressing another group or something. So it's like she just has to get all that stuff in there and kind of stitch it together. And so it's very predictable, follows just the familiar beats of YA fiction. Anyone versed in the genre will not be surprised by any of the revelations or twists on offer. So the secrets, everything is telegraphed very early. The climax resolves in a fairly straightforward, sort of heroic fashion. Triss overcomes the final obstacles. The antagonist's plan is defeated, and they escape to fight another day. And I guess at a basic level, it's kind of satisfying, but it all proceeds without challenging any expectations. And also the denouement, the conclusion, is very abrupt. It just basically ends immediately after this sort of threat is neutralized. It's like, all right, that's that. It's done. And again, there are sequels to this book, but it's funny how it just sort of stops. And so there's lots of adrenaline, I guess, in the storyline, but you can't. It's sort of on rails, right? It's sort of hitting the beats of kind of YA dystopian fiction, but it's not doing anything to develop the world or develop the characters in interesting ways. And let's see. So let's talk about originality in a crowded genre, right? So Divergent was published in 2011. And comparisons to the earlier dystopian YA books were immediate and inevitable. And critics and readers alike noted the novel's very conspicuous similarities to the other hits of the era. Most prominently, of course, was Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games, which had debuted in 2008. And then, to a slightly lesser extent, The Maze Runner, which debuted in 2009. And these also feature teenagers in bleak, controlled futures fighting against oppressive systems. And Divergent was hardly the first book to imagine a post-apocalyptic society stratified into factions or districts, and nor was it the first to follow a brave young heroine leading a rebellion. In fact, the broad strokes of Divergent's narrative feel exceedingly familiar. In fact, I think we could compile a checklist of genre conventions that Divergent dutifully employs, right? We have a sorting ceremony, which is very reminiscent of the Hogwarts houses in Harry Potter. We've got a series of deadly trials and tests that are, they're kind of the same as the survival contests of the Hunger Games. You've got a protagonist whose special status sort of marks her as the only one capable of resisting the villain's evil plan, which is, of course, a trope common in just countless heroes' journey stories. You have a dystopian government whose sinister leader could have stepped out of just any number of other similar tales. And I'm not saying that Divergent is plagiarizing those works, but it so clearly follows the formula that was already well established by the time that Roth wrote it. So it's very, very derivative, and I'm sure that this was written after after Hunger Games was a hit, right? Roth was like, oh, I could write that, and that's what happened, right? She wrote it, someone published it, and there we are. And this major plot device that she uses, this dividing society into the personality based kind of caste system, so we've seen that a million times before, right? So it's very unoriginal, foundation for a story, and she doesn't try and do anything with it either. So it's this sort of very striking lack of originality that's a frequent point of criticism. Even the title Divergent implies deviating from the norm, but this book adheres to all of the genre norms rather than breaking free of any of them. And from the authoritarian adult regime, anything from 1984 to The Giver, the angsty teen love story, Twilight or Hunger Games or Harry Potter or all of them. It's almost like just a collage or like a greatest hits from earlier successful YA or science fiction stories, right? And like there are a couple of interesting ideas in there. The notion that virtues could become dangerous if you take them to extremes, but there's nothing, nothing happens with that makes up for the utter lack of originality in the rest of it. And by the time it gets to the climax, if you've read any dystopian fiction, or you can absolutely anticipate the broad outcome. The brave youths defy a corrupt system and ignite the spark of rebellion. So there's very little in the story, in the world building that anyone would call innovative, and it just borrows too liberally from these predecessors and completely fails to weave those influences into something greater than the sum of their parts. And those comparisons to the Hunger Games are just particularly unavoidable. So both feature this courageous teen girl fighting an oppressive order. But Divergent does it worse. Whatever you think of the Hunger Games, Divergent does it much worse. And Hunger Games does at least have some sort of commentary on media and class disparity and war and things like this, oppression. But the Divergent really just has this sort of superficial allegory about personality types and control. And it just doesn't have the same resonance. And District 12 and the Capitol in Hunger Games, they're quite decent metaphors or representations of inequality, but the factions in Divergent are kind of just abstract and arbitrary and just very bland. And I think Katniss is just a little bit more complex, but and she isn't that complex either, right? And she's just a bit kind of more raw, where Triss is just a little kind of conventional and safe. And even in the Maze Runner, which Maze Runner was starts with this sort of kind of strange, a mystery. You have this group of kids. I think they've been sort of they've mind washed. Their brains have been, their memories have been wiped, and they're sort of in this strange maze, and they don't know why they're there. And so that is sort of more kind of engaging, or doing something a little bit more interesting. It sort of keeps the readers guessing about the true nature of the dystopia that they're in at the beginning. But Divergent just kind of lays it out and spells it all out for you, right? The faction system, the villainous scheming, it's just kind of spelled out for you. There's really not any leaps of imagination that might have set this apart from the YA books at the time. So maybe we could say it competently executes a formula, certainly doesn't diverge from it. And yeah, so given all that, right? Why what like Divergent was extremely popular and successful at the time. And even despite this derivative nature, it did seem to strike a chord with the audience when it debuted. But I think that's largely due to the cultural moment in which it appeared, right? When it debuted. So the novel was published in 2011. It was right on the heels of the massive success of the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games was huge, right? You'd had Harry Potter, Twilight, and then Hunger Games, and they were all extremely, extremely successful. And there was this sort of broader kind of frenzy at the time for this YA genre fiction. And the publishing houses and Hollywood studios at the time were just eagerly seeking the next big young adult franchise, right? So if you think about how lucrative Harry Potter or Twilight and Hunger Games was, there was just this hunger for more of that, right? And so in that atmosphere, Divergent was sort of primed for success, and succeed it did, at least initially. Okay, so Summit Entertainment purchased the film rights almost immediately in 2011, and the promotion at the time was just hyping it as the next must-read saga, the next Hunger Games. And the first movie was released in 2014. By the time the first movie came out, there was already quite an inbuilt fan base, and it was, sort of topping bestseller lists. And it really was a juggernaut success at the time. It was huge. So when I was looking this up, in 2013 alone, right, just before the marketing for the film was ramping up, the Divergent books sold a combined 6.7 million copies in 2013 alone. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? And Publishers Weekly called 2013 the year of Divergent. The novel spent weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, won Reader's Choice Awards, and all this other stuff. And there was this anticipation for the Hollywood film. And so I think Divergent arrived at exactly the right time. So it caught that post-Hunger Games wave and filled the post-Hunger Games void and gave readers this new world and a new heroine to idolize. But why did it resonate so much? Even when most people recognized how derivative it seemed, or it was just seemed generally accepted that, oh, this is kind of derivative, this one. So I think it's just because it's a straightforward empowerment fantasy, right? So Triss is the kind of protagonist that I think lots of adolescents like to root for. She's a modest, ordinary girl who discovers her inner strength and becomes a hero. So we have a very simple journey from self-doubt to confidence. That she's underestimated by lots of people around her. She proves them wrong. And this is a narrative that's just tailor-made for teenagers who may feel underestimated or constrained themselves. And her victories, like beating up, tough guys in fights, and conquering these simulated fears, and fighting evil authority figures, provide this vicarious thrill of empowerment. So readers can see in her a reflection of their own potential. But importantly, Roth doesn't make Triss overly special at the outset, right? She does have this Divergent label, but she's really just another kid, right? And so sends the message that any ordinary teenager could become extraordinary with bravery and determination. And so that's very relatable, and it's amped up by the first person narration, which is first person present tense, places the reader directly into Triss's mindset. And I think it's very easy for young readers to slip into her skin and imagine facing the dauntless challenges themselves. Then also, I think this faction concept has an intrinsic appeal to adolescents. So this idea of sorting people by personality traits taps into developmental fascination with identity categories. So much like the appeal of Hogwarts houses or personality quizzes, MBTI and all that kind of stuff. So, high school can sometimes feel like a world of factions, of cliques and clubs and social labels, and Divergent is an exaggerated mirror of that reality. And so I think this system that forces individuals to choose a single identity and then explores the fallout is enticing to young readers. And then I think so this drama of having to pick where you belong at 16, I think, speaks to this sort of core teenage experience of self-determination. And at the same time, I think Triss reassures people that no one can be reduced to a single label. And this is a very comforting message, right, for especially for young people. In Triss's story, when the world tries to box you in, being different, being divergent is ultimately a strength. And so I think that theme probably resonated with a lot of young people who felt out of place, or that felt that other people didn't understand them. And okay, so before we wrap up, one of the things I most want to talk about is the lack of long-term relevance that this book has experienced. Right, Hunger Games still seems to have quite a significant fandom. Harry Potter does. Even I suspect Twilight probably does as well. And Divergent was extremely successful for a moment, but it hasn't had the same sort of cultural footprint as some of these other sort of franchises have. In fact, I think it's proven extremely shallow, especially when compared to its peers like Hunger Games. So over a decade after its release, this initial glow has long faded, and it is absolutely on the periphery of in the sort of the YA fiction pantheon. And I think there's several factors that have contributed to this. So first of all, the YA dystopian trend itself had cooled off by the late 2010s. There's a bunch of there was a bunch of flops, right? They were trying to adapt these all of these book series, and there was like so many of them that came out and flopped. Like I Am Number Four, the girl from, oh god, what's her name, Chloe something, she did one. There was a bunch of them that came out and they all started flopping, right? And so this had been a very popular genre in the early 2010s, and it very quickly became oversaturated. There was all of these sort of copycat kind of storylines and dystopian settings and so on, and the fatigue set in pretty quickly. And Divergent was a product of that boom, and when that boom ended, it struggled to maintain any kind of relevance whatsoever. And so Divergent was just capitalizing on this on the trend, right? And I think Divergent has become like emblematic of the burnout of this cycle of YA fiction. So there was no new ground broken by the novel, and so it hasn't become even like a YA classic that I think future generations are going to revisit. Instead, it's kind of remembered as part of this fad that passed and maybe wasn't that great at the time. And the trajectory of the film series is also quite interesting. So the Hunger Games, there's 3 Hunger Games books. They did that thing where they split the final book into 2 movies so they could make twice the money. And the Divergent movies, the first 2 films, I think they both each made about 300 million. It's pretty good, right? So but they thought, okay, well, if we split book number 3 into 2 films, we can make 600 million. And but they did that, and they released the first half of the 3rd book, and it was a flop, and it flopped to such an extent that they didn't even make the final part of the series, which is really incredible when you think about it. It performed so poorly that they just didn't even bother making the final part. So the on-screen story of the film adaptation, starring Shailene Woodley and a bunch of other actors who are quite recognizable and well known now, just didn't get finished. And it really is a strange thing to have happened for like this big, that could have been like $1 billion franchise, right? And instead they kind of just tanked it by trying to be too greedy, and people just weren't interested. And I think, it's just an indication that this franchise had completely failed to maintain any sort of public interest, right? And the audience that had grown up with this weren't invested in it anymore. They weren't growing up with this series, whereas Hunger Games, um, people stuck with Hunger Games to the end, right? And even now, having said that, though, they've tried to extend the Hunger Games franchise recently. In the past couple of years, they've made some prequel films. There's been some prequel books and prequel films which haven't done anywhere near as well as the original books or the original films, right? So I think maybe there's not even that much interest now, not much interest left for Hunger Games. But I don't think, as far as I know, there hasn't even been an attempt to do like a streaming series or anything for Divergent, right? There haven't been any attempts to sort of milk the franchise further. I don't think. And so yeah, Divergent just doesn't have the enduring fandom of like Harry Potter or Hunger Games, and I don't think it's going to find new readers, right? Like its moment has passed. And the only time I think you'll see it referred to now is in sort of retrospective lists of early 2010s YA books, right? So yeah, so kind of interesting to see what happened with this. I think Divergent did the right things at the time, right, to become a hit. But it was completely derivative, right? It was capitalizing on a trend, but it wasn't doing anything to transcend that. There was no originality at all. And the fundamental issue comes down to originality and depth. And whereas Divergent is arguably like a competent amalgam of the tropes that were popular around the time, it wasn't any kind of bold new vision. And it might have an interesting question at its heart, but it's very perfunctory in the way that it sort of talks about that. And so it really just blended into this sort of cycle of YA dystopias that were popular at the time. And now that cycle is over, it seems like the Divergent books have been forgotten. And, the Hunger Games will probably, still have an ongoing fandom. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they remake the original films, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if they were quite successful. But I can't see anyone, I can't see anybody doing another Divergent, a remake of Divergent. Maybe they will. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there'll be like a streaming series. But I can't expect them. I doubt there'll be much interest in it. And so yeah. Anyway, I think ultimately, I think Divergent is just its moment has passed, right? The other, sort of YA books or series like The Giver or His Dark Materials or something, or Ender's Game, these they all have something a bit deeper or more interesting going on inside them, right? Divergent was extremely superficial, doesn't have any sort of philosophical or emotional imprint that the adults would want to ponder. So if you read this as a child, you're probably not going to revisit it as an adult and find anything interesting in it. Adults still reread Harry Potter or His Dark Materials or whatever. And yeah, so I think that's it. I've spoken about Divergent for far too long. I can't believe I've been speaking about it for this long, and and I don't have anything else to say about it. So yeah, so that was Divergent. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing me waffle. I apologize if I waffled about that for too long. And I think the next one from those radio shows that I did, oh, I've completely forgotten now what it was. Anyway, I'll do more of those. I'll review more of these books from the radio show that I used to work for at some point in the future. Take care, and thanks for watching.